If you'll allow me to start things off here with a little nostalgia trip, as a child back in the 1970s, I can remember running home one afternoon after elementary school to catch this movie on the 3:30 movie, which was how I saw many classic science fiction films back in those formative years. Now, I was particularly fond of the Japanese giant monster films, the Godzillas and the Gamras and so forth. And those movies tended to air repeatedly on local television, sometimes, 5 or 6 times in a single week. But I only saw Yongari Monster from the Deep that one time, that one day, and it made a real impression on me, such that I ended up building my own Yongari toy figure by gluing a horn on the nose of a T-Rex type model and putting some spikes on the tail and painting it. Watching the film now in this pristine-looking high-def widescreen transfer is, of course, a much different experience. We can see details and flaws that my little 13-inch tube television certainly didn't reveal, such as you can see the seams between the panels in the outer space backdrop in this opening sequence. My name is Steve Reifel, and I've written about and provided commentaries for a good number of Japanese science fiction films, but of course, this is a South Korean production. And even as it incorporates many of the elements and tropes of the Japanese monster films, everything from the man in the latex monster suit trampling through miniature cities to the throngs of people evacuating, the scientists, the military men, and the precocious little boy. In many interesting ways, this is much more than just a Godzilla knockoff. And I think you'll find that the circumstances and the background of this production are fascinating. Joining me from South Korea, I'd like to introduce the writer Kim Song-ho, a film journalist and blogger who's written about this film for the website Sci-Fi Japan. Welcome, Song-ho.
Hello, I'm Kim Song-ho from South Korea. I've been interested in Yongari Monster from the Deep since I first saw it 18 years ago, so it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk about it for the commentary.
Okay, and Song-ho will be joining me off and on throughout this commentary. And I want to thank you up front, Song-ho, because a lot of the information that we're going to present comes from your research. First things first, Yongari. I've heard people say Yongari, Yongari, Yongari. What is the correct pronunciation? We should nail that down because I'm going to be trying to pronounce a lot of Korean words, but I should at least get the monster's name right.
It's Yongari, Yongari, and I think your pronunciation is quite good.
Okay, and where does the name come from? What does it mean?
The name Yongari is originated from a combination of two Korean words. One is Yong, meaning a dragon, and the other is Bulgasari. And Bulgasari is a fictional monster which eats metal objects.
All right, so Yong means dragon, and Gari is taken from Pulgasari, which is a legend from the Choson dynasty era, and that story was also made into a giant monster movie from North Korea, which we'll talk about later on a little bit. As the story begins, a wedding has just taken place, apparently on the grounds of South Korea's version of Cape Canaveral, and the groom is South Korea's top astronaut, and his father, the guy here with the gangster sunglasses, is the head of the country's fictional space agency. It's important to take a note of the fact that the bubble that the story takes place within, the two families that are at the center of the story, are basically the upper echelon of society. The other father in the equation here is a high-ranking politician of some sort. It's never quite spelled out, but he looks to be either the governor or the mayor of Seoul. And now we're just about to meet the precocious little boy who's at the heart of this story. By the way, he's called Incho in the English dubbed version of this film, but not only is that not his real name, that's not even a Korean name. He has stolen an itching ray gun from his sister's boyfriend, the scientist Ilu, who's following behind in a car and will kind of put a stop to this nonsense. The little boy's quite lucky he didn't run these people off the road and kill them with his little prank. Here's the young scientist Ilu, and his name is mistranslated as well. It's actually Il Woo. It's as if the people who were dubbing the movie had trouble pronouncing Korean names, so they just kind of made up their own. The little boy here kind of sets the tone right here at the outset. This movie is closer in spirit to the Gamera films, I would say, which were very kid-friendly, than to the Godzilla films of this particular time period. Godzilla films were not kid-unfriendly, but they hadn't put children at the center of the story yet.
I think the boy named Young was chosen to be the hero of the movie because basically the film is a family-friendly production, so it was important to have a character to whom the audience have a sympathy with. So that's why he was a very light-hearted and likable boy from the start of the movie.
Okay. Well, the country of South Korea is essentially a character in the background of this film, and I want to begin by contrasting Korea then and now. And we should acknowledge up front that most Americans know very little about Korea. Certainly we know less about it than we do about China or Japan. We certainly know a little bit about North Korea and the anxiety over its nuclear weapons, but what do we know about South Korea? We know that South Korea is now a major exporter of popular culture. That's probably what we're most familiar with, things like Gangnam Style and K-dramas and K-pop. We even have K-pop conventions here in the United States now. South Korea is a democracy. It currently has a female president elected in 2013. It's a strategic and economic ally of the United States and a major economic power, a world economic power with the 13th biggest GDP. It's a major exporter of electronic devices and automobiles. But the movie we're watching here, Yonggari, was made in 1967 when South Korea was a very, very different place. The opening scenes at the Space Center are complete science fiction. South Korea didn't have a space program at that time, and in fact, it wouldn't launch a satellite of its own until 2013. In 1967, South Korea was neither a rich country nor a democracy. Its GDP was on par with the poor African nations, and its government was a military dictatorship. This film was produced at the tail end of South Korea's first big post-war cinema boom, and this film occupies a somewhat unique place in both monster movie history and certainly Korean film history. It was an anomaly. It was said to be the first science fiction monster film to come out of South Korea, and it was directed by Kim Ki-duk, who was one of the country's most respected and certainly most commercially successful directors of that period. This was just 22 years after the end of World War II, which put an end to roughly a half century of Japanese colonial rule over the Korean peninsula. And it was just 15 years after the end of the Korean War, which left the country tragically divided between North and South along the 30th parallel and locked in a perpetual state of tension, which continues to today. This gentleman here in the pink pajamas, who appears to be staring at the same space backdrop that we saw in the opening sequence, is our heroic astronaut Yu Kwang-nam, and he's about to have his honeymoon interrupted at precisely the wrong moment. And he's played by Lee Soon-jae, a very, very popular actor still to this day in South Korea. So after the Korean War, the South Korean capital of Seoul was totally devastated, and the country effectively became a U.S. client state, dependent upon American economic and military aid for many, many years. You'll see evidence of South Korea's identity crisis throughout this film. There's big 1950s Chevy and Ford cars in the background, contrasted with the women in their traditional silk wedding hanboks and the men in their American-style suits, which I believe are called yangboks. It's also ironic that this film was made at a time when South Korea was determined to cast off the legacy of Japanese colonial rule, and the importation of Japanese culture, books, manga, music, and movies was effectively banned by law. And yet here we have what is essentially a South Korean Godzilla, not only inspired by the success of the giant monster movies from Japan, but some of the technicians who created the Godzilla and Gamera films were brought to South Korea and employed on this production. Notice here how the actors skillfully turn away from the camera as they kiss. There were strict government standards and oversight of the film industry, and this kind of content would have been scrutinized for obscenity. We also need to mention that Yonggari appears to be the very first South Korean feature film to get a wide commercial release in the United States, although it went virtually unnoticed because it was a non-theatrical release. American International began distributing Yonggari to television stations in or around 1969 with the dialogue dubbed into English, and that's the version that we're watching here now. Unfortunately, and somewhat unbelievably, the original Korean language version of this film is essentially lost, at least in its complete form. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And as a result of that, Yonggari has never been released in any home video format in its native South Korea. The Korean title of this film is Daegusu, I know I'm butchering this, Daegusu Yonggari, or The Great Monster Yonggari. And it was a relatively huge production by 1967 South Korean standards. The budget was reportedly 30 million Korean won, and as South Korea was a country on the mend, its currency at that time was pegged at 255 won to the US dollar, which means that this film cost at that time approximately $117,000. Now, if that figure sounds minuscule today, remember that South Korea at that time was essentially a third world economy, so this represented a major budget, about 3 to 4 times that of the average Korean film. And in fact, the money went quite a long way. They built many miniature sets for this movie, including this one of the Space Center, which is quite impressive. And they were able to pay for our actress's Audrey Hepburn outfit, which may seem like a small thing, but it actually helps to build the fantasy of a fully developed and prosperous and advanced Korea. Western clothes and fashions symbolizing progress. The film opened in Seoul on August 13th of 1967, and in its theatrical run, it sold either 110,000 or 150,000 tickets. We've seen conflicting information there. Sometimes I've even seen the figure 160,000. And again, that may sound small, but there were far fewer cinemas in South Korea at that time. There were only about 570 screens in the entire country. And the population of the entire country was only about 25 million total, less than half of today. Also, any film that sold more than 100,000 tickets was then considered a huge success. In fact, the book The History of Korean Cinema by Lee Yong-il, which is probably the definitive text on Korean film, has an appendix in the back of the book listing all films that reached the 100,000 ticket plateau. And for the year 1967, Yonggari is listed among the 14 films that managed to do that. Well, in the nearly 50 years since then, rather unbelievably, this film has been much more accessible in America than in South Korea. The American version, Yonggari Monster from the Deep, played on over-the-air and then on cable television in the United States off and on until the 1990s. And it was released in multiple home video formats, starting with a VHS videotape. Remember those from Orion in 1989. Then it was on Laserdisc, and finally in September of 2007, MGM put out the film in a widescreen DVD edition that was sourced from an interpositive of the complete film that was found still remaining among the materials that were acquired and prepared when the film was first imported to the United States circa 1969. And it was still in superb condition, and that material is also the source of the high-def image that we're watching now. There's an interesting low-tech effect shot coming up right here in which a nuclear explosion is simulated by having the smoke rise up and then collide with apparently a layer of glass and spreading out underneath it. It's a little different than the way Eiji Tsuburaya did it in the Japanese films, where they often would have a water tank and they would pour paint into that and film it upside down and then flip the image. Our hero astronaut has been sent on a very dangerous mission to spy on a nuclear test. Now, it's just another way in which the film portrays South Korea as being far more developed and far more advanced and far more influential and important in world affairs than it actually was. It's similar to the way the Japanese science fiction films also portray Japan as having a seat at the table of world power and a full-blown military, industrial, aerospace complex of its own. So about this sequence, I found it kind of curious that the nuclear test that Korea is spying on, it takes place in the Middle East, according to the English language dialogue. Now, I assumed that that was another mistake, just like the two characters' names that were mistranslated, because there was no nuclear testing going on in the Middle East at that time, and even if there was, South Korea would have been much more concerned about the testing going on next door in China. But Song-ho, even though the complete Korean language version of the film doesn't exist at the present time, you've read the original Korean language script, which is on hold at the Korean Film Archive in Seoul. My understanding is that when the film was dubbed into English, the story is more or less the same, but there are some minor differences. What are the differences between the Korean language script and the English dialogue?
There are many tidbits. For example, when they say just a Middle East in the English version, they have the original name.
Okay.
Basically, the meaning of the lines are almost the same. The Korean dialogues and English dialogues, but in English dialogues case, it lost tremendous amounts of details.
I see.
Yeah, so that is the main difference between those two versions.
Right, okay. And you had shared with me earlier that the country conducting the nuclear test, according to the Korean language script, is called Oribia, and the location of the test is the Goma Desert. You see, I had always assumed, looking at the backdrop, that with the snow-capped mountains, that this test was supposed to be in the Soviet Union or China somewhere.
And one interesting tidbit is that the other part of the script, the same Goma Desert, is spelled as Gobi Desert. So it's probably a typo, but it is apparent that the writer tried to describe that Yongari was originated from the Middle East.
We mentioned earlier that MGM put this film out on DVD a few years ago, and that was the first time that Yongari was available in the United States in scope. Previously, all that we had access to was the television version in pan and scan. The MGM Scope DVD was sourced from a textless interpositive of the complete film, and that's why at the very beginning, when, if you recall, we saw the camera slowly panning over the outer space backdrop, that would have been the place where the opening credits would have appeared in the original Korean language theatrical version. The brief credits that you saw here were actually a recreation or restoration of the credits from the old American TV version, which didn't include that long opening pan, and that's why the American version for TV was a couple of minutes shorter. Song-ho, given how rare this film has been to find in Korea over the decades, how and when did you first encounter Yongari? When did you first see it?
First, I did not know Yongari was from a movie. When I was little, I used to hear people say Yongari Tongpyo, but I did not exactly know what that meant. I only guessed that the word Yong meant a dragon in Korean, so I thought maybe it was related to a monster. But actually, Yongari Tongpyo is a slang that represents a strong person, both physically and mentally. It is unclear if the word has been derived from Yongari the monster, but it is still often used by the Korean people.
Yongari is a slang term for a tough guy or something?
It's Yongari Tongpyo. Yongari is just the name of the monster, but Yongari Tongpyo is a slang.
Okay, so when did you see the movie then?
I can't remember exactly when or how I first heard about it, but possibly during a conversation with my friends in the 80s or from fellow film buffs in the 90s. The focus of the conversation we had was that there was a Korean Godzilla movie called Yongari and even a North Korean Godzilla movie called Bulgasari. I just thought that it would be cool to have a chance to see any of them. And it was December 1997, I was finally able to watch Yongari for the first time. there was a small film society which was moderated by a science fiction editor. The members regularly rent a small cafe and watched a science fiction movie there and discussed about it. And the last screening of 1997 was a Korean monster movie double feature, Yongari Monster from the Deep and Ape. The program was very unique at that time when Yongari was commonly known as a lost film, almost an urban legend among the film buffs.
All right, so what version of the film did you see then?
It was the American VHS cassette from Orion, dubbed in English. And it was a great fun, but it was very strange to have watched a Korean movie dubbed in English, and at that time it was thought to be the only way to watch it.
That's right, because in South Korea, this film basically disappeared after its original theatrical release in 1967. I understand that bootleg or black market type videos turned up at some point, but they too were of the English language version. The original Korean language version appears to be lost, as we said, and we'll get into the reasons why a little bit later on, but sometime in the 2000s, the Korean Film Archive, which is a really wonderful national nonprofit type organization that's dedicated to preserving and documenting the history of classic Korean cinema, the archive acquired or located a partial, incomplete 35mm print of the Korean version of Yongari, but it was only 48 minutes long and it was missing a lot of footage. And not only that, it was so heavily damaged that it couldn't be projected. So eventually what they did was they converted it to digibeta, and this quote-unquote imperfect restoration version premiered at the first Cheongmuro International Film Festival, and that was in 2008. Cheongmuro is the section of Seoul where the movie studios were centered back in the heyday of classic Korean cinema. And to the present day, that 48-minute, incomplete, badly damaged version is all that remains of the original Korean language Yongari. There is no complete 35mm print or other elements known to exist. And so if you're interested, you can watch that 48-minute version. You can probably find it on YouTube. And I understand that it's also available as a VOD for pay-per-view service on the Korean Film Archive website, although it may only be accessible if you're in Korea. This disaster conference of the military and government officials is a fairly standard type of scene for this genre, but one thing that's a little different here is that there are no Americans to be found in this scene or anywhere else in this movie. And that's quite a difference from the Japanese films, particularly from the late 50s and 60s, which portrayed Japan as fully capable of handling a crisis on its own, but yet there were American advisors or maybe an American scientist, an American astronaut, or scenes of an international scope. Those films really portrayed Japan as part of the larger world, and what's happening in this film seems to be a much more concerted effort to portray South Korea as fully capable of handling its own affairs should there ever be a threat from the north, be it a military incursion or, in this case, a monster. There were 50,000 or so U.S. troops in South Korea at this time, and it's probably unlikely that the South Korean military would have been able to handle this situation and launch this kind of counteroffensive without America's help.
The United Nations has just announced that they will help us. An expert team of scientists has been ordered to come to Korea. They should be here.
I don't believe those scientists from the UN actually ever arrive, at least not on camera in the film. Again, it's all part of the fantasy of the film of showing a more capable, more advanced, developed, powerful Korea. Yongari wasn't shown on television in South Korea until 44 years after its theatrical release. On June 19th of 2011, it was shown on the EBS network for the first time, and it was in high definition. But the version of the film that was shown, of course, was the English dubbed version, which had to be subtitled in Korean using those Korean language scripts from the original film that are held at the Korean Film Archive. Kind of reverse translation, if you will. So that basically brings us up to speed with regard to Yongari's availability in South Korea. And now we're about to come up on the scene of Yongari's first appearance in the film. And even if this is a lighthearted family type of monster movie a lot of the time, It's not without its serious side and without its political content. The place where Yonggari first appears is Panmunjom, and that's a village located just above the line separating the north from the south. And it was there at Panmunjom that the armistice agreement ending the Korean War was signed in 1953. So, symbolically, you can say that the monster represents the South's fears in those days. It rises up from the ground in the place where the war stopped and resumes fighting, and it swoops down from the north to destroy the city of Seoul all over again. Sung-ho, what's your take on the location of Yonggari's first appearance?
At first, the director Kim thought very hard about where Yonggari should appear for the first time, and he chose Panmunjom because Korea has a very special position in the world as the country is divided in two. So he thought it could add a very unique and peculiar tone to the movie, and he also thought it might attract the attention from the foreign audiences.
Interesting. Well, there really hasn't been much political analysis or academic writing about Yonggari, which is probably not surprising. However, in the year 2000, the film scholar and critic Kim So-young published what is probably the first scholarly essay about Yonggari in Korean. And a few interesting points were made in that essay. It mentions the evacuation scenes that are coming up shortly and compares those scenes to the original Godzilla, in that just as the crowds fleeing in Godzilla would have reminded audiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this film similarly came just about a decade after the Korean War, and in those evacuation scenes, as well as the scenes of destruction, the film is similarly reaching back to those same kinds of wartime nightmares. The essay also brought up the theme of masculinity, interestingly enough, and mentions that both the astronaut and the young scientist are, quote, tested to prove their masculinity throughout the story, unquote. And it goes on to allude to a crisis of masculinity in the nation of South Korea at that time. And most interestingly, the essay goes on to say that the little boy is the real hero of this story because Yonggari is really just a mirror image of the little boy, and the two of them understand each other, the boy serving as a symbol of Korea's bright future. By the way, this is probably the most unbelievable thing in the movie, that this gentleman would survive that toy car crash and be able to make it all the way here to deliver the film. He's the hero. I'd like to talk for a little bit about the shared history between Korea and Japan. Not only because this film, in a small sense, is a South Korean-Japanese co-production, but also because this history informs the politics of the film, and it also has a great deal to do with the formation of cinema in South Korea, and a lot of the participants in this production were affected by it. The modern history of Japan and Korea really starts in the late 1800s, when the Choson dynasty, which had ruled Korea for about 500 years and was responsible for establishing much of the modern way of life there, it started to go into deep decline just around the time that the Meiji government of Japan was transforming that country from a medieval society into a modern, industrialized and westernized nation, both economically and culturally and militarily. Now, as Japan began expanding its sphere of influence, one of its goals was to exert power over Korea before one of the Western colonial powers beat them to it. So in 1876, Japan used the old gunboat diplomacy, coercing Korea into signing a lopsided trade treaty. So just as Commodore Perry's black ships had forced open Japan to the west 20 years earlier, now Japan was forcing the isolated little country of Korea to open up its ports. Now, fast forward to 1905, and Japan becomes emboldened by its victory over Russia in war, and it goes on to launch a massive expansion into Korea and China. And at the end of 1905, Japan forced Korea to become its protectorate. And this is really an important date in history because this essentially marks the end of Korea's sovereignty as a single unified nation on the peninsula. On August 29th of 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, and that date has been commemorated as a day of national shame in Korea. And for the next 35 years, Japan maintained a rather harsh and sometimes brutal rule over Korea, using the Imperial Army to crush dissent. In 1919, there were widespread demonstrations against the Japanese colonial rule, and the Imperial Army responded by killing an estimated 7,000 demonstrators and arresting 40,000 people. During Japan's second war against China, and also during World War II, Koreans were drafted into the Japanese army and forced to fight against China. Incidentally, there were quite a few Koreans who managed to switch sides and fight against Japan, and some of those men eventually became the founders of the North Korean regime. About 5 million Korean men were forcibly conscripted into the Japanese army, and about 600,000 Koreans were sent to Japan to work in the war factories, and a couple thousand of those people were said to have died in the atomic bombings. Japan forced tens of thousands of Korean women into sexual slavery as quote-unquote comfort women for the Japanese soldiers. And in 1939, Japan forced an estimated 80% of all Koreans to change their names to Japanese names, essentially robbing them of their nationality. Here we get a brief look at how the ordinary people of Seoul are affected by this disaster. There's a quick shot here of a traditional Korean row of houses right in the middle of a rebuilding city. Seoul was, as we said, on the rebound after the Korean War, but it still looks totally different here than it does today with all the modern skyscrapers. And here we have all the ordinary poor citizens of Seoul fleeing on foot, carrying their belongings on their heads, or maybe they have a pushcart. A few scenes later, you're going to see Sunan, her mother, and the little boy, her younger brother, visiting Ilu at his house. And it's a big Western-style house in the middle of Seoul. It's clearly upper class. And in fact, you can see the Cadillac pulling into the driveway while the poor people run by with their pushcarts and their belongings on top of their heads. With the economy as poor as it was, there really wasn't much of a middle class in those days. There was an enormous gulf between upper and lower classes. This film, despite its low budget, has a great number of special effects shots. And right here, we're getting some of our first really good looks at the Yongari monster suit, as well as a lot of the miniatures and miniature sets here. The monster suit was built under the supervision of Masao Yagi, who came from a family of people in Japan who had made monster suits dating back to the first Godzilla in 1954. And Masao Yagi was primarily responsible for the designing and building of the Gamera suit for the first Gamera film 2 years before this. In some of these scenes, you can actually see a nozzle inside of the mouth of the Yongari suit when it shoots out some sort of accelerant to create the flame. Other than the fact that it is a dinosaurish type of creature, Yongari really doesn't resemble Godzilla all that much. Songho, what do you know about the designing and building of this monster suit?
According to director Kim Ki-duk, the Yongari suit was designed in Korea, and the Japanese special effect team built it in Japan according to the design. But when the actual suit was delivered to the studio in Korea, director Kim was a bit disappointed as he wanted to look more scary and more formidable. But unfortunately, there were not enough time and budget to rebuild the suit, so the shooting had to proceed with the original suit.
Well, I guess I can understand why he might have been disappointed. The costume doesn't have a lot of bulk to it, and it looks a little goofy when you view it from head on. But I think in profile, it looks quite formidable, quite interesting with those tusks and the horn on its nose. And I really still like the way the eyes light up. I mean, that might have been one of the reasons that it connected with me as a child, that the monster really doesn't look real and it doesn't look threatening, but it does look interesting and it has a certain charm and personality. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I have the similar opinion of the suit because years after watching the Yongari for the first time, I had a chance to see some of the Gamera films, and I thought the monster Barugon has the Yongari head, and he has a similar horn that also blinks. So when I heard that the the suit makers worked both Yongari and camera films, I could understand the connection between the two designs. Although the film has many scenes depicting destruction or mayhem, the whole tone of the film is strangely lighthearted. And I think that has the strong relationship with the design of the monster.
In this sequence, we get a glimpse of the irresponsible class whose behavior isn't befitting a nation that's in crisis, certainly. These rich guys are stuffing their faces and drinking beer and throwing their money around, and then the film cuts to a nightclub where these irresponsible teenagers are pouring beer on each other's heads and rocking out, not a care in the world. And then the film, through these canted angles, cuts to the streets where people are fleeing on foot again, and we have pieces of debris falling on them, which is a nice touch. And we're actually seeing people in peril and, being harmed by the destruction that the monster is causing, which is not always the case in the Japanese films. They're bringing the destruction and danger home here a little bit. As we said, Japanese special effects technicians came in, but it was largely a Korean crew that was totally inexperienced in making this kind of film, and you can see some of that inexperience in these sequences. They had access to an optical printer because there are a couple of composite shots. Right here, the people running down the street look like they're about 30 feet tall, so there are some issues with scale, not just in this shot, but in a couple of places. Sometimes it looks like the miniature sets could have been photographed a little differently. For instance, the backdrops are sometimes a little too close to the miniatures themselves, so there's not a lot of depth there. But that may have been a restriction of the size of the soundstage, the building that they were working in. Nevertheless, they do, a number of things right here as well. They used a lot of smoke in some of these shots, so these sequences really have some good atmosphere about them. And Yongari does do a heck of a lot of damage here, which is the real main attraction. There's some nice sound effects work going on in that sequence, and I also paused there to give you a chance to listen briefly to the original score by Jeon Jeong-kyun. This is not the most distinctive monster movie music that you've ever heard, but nevertheless, Jeon was a very highly acclaimed composer, film composer at that time. And in fact, one of his most well-known films is called Late Autumn. It was directed by Lee Man-hee in 1966, and that is considered to be one of the most respected Korean films of the period, but it's also a lost film. In a moment here, Yongari is going to pick up a poor, unsuspecting citizen of Seoul and just kind of toss him to the ground. So that kind of begs the question, what is Yongari's motivation? He's not here to eat people. We'll find out later that it's in pursuit of, it consumes energy, and that's what it's looking for. But interestingly, the screenwriter of this film, Hwang Woon-hyun, was quoted at the time the movie was made as saying that Yongari does not intentionally try to harm mankind, and the destruction that it causes is simply a consequence of the monster moving around. Incidentally, Yongari was said to be 35 meters tall, about 15 meters shorter than the original Godzilla, and the screenwriter also said that Yongari was originally a single-cell organism from outer space, and that it grew to gigantic size due to radiation exposure, hence the nuclear explosion. None of this is mentioned in the film, as you know, and as you see, the monster rises up from beneath the ground. So we don't know if that detail was actually part of the script at one point and deleted, or if he was just making this all up. I want to return to the troubled history shared by Korea and Japan, but there's also a scene coming up right here that ties in directly with that. During Japanese colonial rule, Korea was modernized in a lot of ways, and one of those was that the city of Seoul underwent extensive industrial and urban development. There were a lot of buildings that were constructed under Japanese rule, and many of those bore Japanese architectural traits. Now, there's a building here that Yongari is going to basically walk right through, and the first time I saw this as an adult, and after having seen the original Godzilla and studied it a little bit, there's a scene here that looks like a tribute to the original Godzilla, where Godzilla destroys the Japanese Diet Building, the Japanese Parliament Building. This building here looks a lot like the Japanese Diet Building in miniature, and I thought that this must be some sort of homage. Now, Song-ho, you related to me that this building that Yongari attacks, it's not an exact replica, but it apparently resembles a Japanese government building from the colonial era. Is that right?
Yes, the building is actually very similar to the Japanese era government building in Seoul. The building was used until the 1945 independence. And after the independence, the building was used as a Korean government building and as a national museum. But since the building symbolizes the Japanese colonization and tragic history, it was decided that it should be collapsed. So the Korean government destroyed it in 1995. And the similarity between this building and the Japanese Diet Building in the original Godzilla show that probably the Japanese crew wanted to make a similar scene, just like other Japanese giant monster movies at the time, but in the point of view of the Korean crew, that might have kind of a double meaning, to crush the symbol of Japanese colonization by a Korean monster.
And by contrast, though certainly not coincidence, the historic South Gate of the city of Seoul, which is the beautiful pagoda-style structure dating back to the 14th century. It was one of 8 gates built by the Chosun dynasty that sort of formed a fortress around the city of Seoul. Well, that's not about to be destroyed. The pilots are going to heroically lead Yongari away from the structure before he can knock it down. It's not entirely clear when motion pictures first appeared in Korea, though one funny story involves an American businessman who in 1898 or so rented out a barn in Seoul and used it as a movie theater and charged people 10 empty cigarette packs for an admission ticket. But that turned out to be essentially a stunt by a tobacco company, a gimmick to try to get people to buy cigarettes. The first commercial movie theaters appeared in the 1910s and 20s, and they were mostly owned by Japanese businessmen. And they showed strictly imported films from America and Europe and Japan. Korea's first feature film was completed in 1923. It was titled The Plighted Love Under the Moon and directed by Yoon Bak-nam. The period of 1926 to 1935 was considered Korea's golden age of silent films. And one landmark film of this period that we should take note of was called Arirang. It was released in 1926 and directed by and starring Na Eun-kyu. And it was a tragic story of a young man who was tortured by the Japanese military police for participating in a political protest. And he's driven mad by his treatment to the point of murdering the son of a wealthy landowner with Japanese ties. The film was a huge hit because of this content, and it inspired a wave of filmmakers to make movies with themes of resisting Japanese power. But incidentally, the film Arirang took its title from Korea's most popular traditional national folk song, and that song, Arirang, is featured in Yongari. We'll discuss that a little bit later on. In 1926, the colonial government imposed the motion picture censorship law, and this gave the Japanese high police, if there was any suspicion of anti-Japanese content going on, they had the power to arrest filmmakers, to detain them, to shut down productions. They could interrogate film crews. They were also on the lookout for anything that would foment Korean nationalism. There were often Japanese military police standing at guard outside at movie theaters to prevent any expression of anti-Japanese sentiment there. In the first half of the 1930s, regulations were so strict that only 3 films could be made per year, and after Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China in 1937, censorship was tightened even further as the Japanese government attempted to use film as a propaganda tool, just as they were doing back at home. All 10 Korean film studios were shut down, and all production was now done under the auspices of the Choson Film Company, which was really a Japanese-run film propaganda unit. In 1942, the production of native Korean films effectively ended, and all films produced from that point on through the end of World War II were actually Japanese propaganda pieces designed to promote military service or to promote the production of military supplies, the unification of Korea and Japan as one nation, the imperial education of Korean children, so on and so forth. The Japanese government dispatched film teams across the country and actually made the Korean citizens watch these things. Korean filmmakers who refused to cooperate and help make propaganda pieces were arrested. Some of them were put into labor camps, and it was only after the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945 that these filmmakers were freed, and then many of them dedicated themselves to rebuilding the film industry in a new liberated Korea. Well, our boy hero has been playing around in the sewers today. He's definitely going to need a bath when he gets home tonight. It's interesting, the relationship between the boy, Young, and Yongari. First of all, their names kind of sound alike, which I just noticed. But he clearly has some sort of sympathetic feeling for the monster, and yet he tortures the monster. A little bit later on, he's going to take that itching ray that he almost, killed somebody with earlier in the film, and he shoots it at the monster as a sort of practical joke. And this ray is so powerful that it wakes the monster up. Probably not the greatest idea in the world, but after that, Yongari is in agony. It's trying to scratch an itch that it just can't scratch. And as it does so, it jumps around, and that's the origin or the catalyst for the famous, among people who know this film, dance scene where the monster kind of does the twist. Here the boy discovers Yongari's weakness, and that ultimately leads everybody down the path of trying to exterminate the monster. And at the end of the film, the little boy, who clearly likes the monster, is kind of laughing and smiling as they're trying to kill it. So something must have got lost in translation there, and indeed something did get lost in translation, and we'll tell you about that a little bit later on. In 1945, when World War II ended, Korea was in total disarray, and as Japan vacated its empire, the Soviet Union and the Americans came in and provisionally occupied different territories that the Japanese were leaving. And that's when the United States somewhat arbitrarily decided to divide the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel and have the Soviet Union be the caretakers of the northern part while the Americans would be the caretakers of the south. The idea was that they would create a unified national government, but nobody could decide or agree who should be in charge or what the government should look like. And so the Americans installed the anti-communist Ri Syngman to lead the South, while the Soviet Union put the communist Kim Il-sung in charge of the North. And in 1950, as you may know, Kim Il-sung invaded the South in an attempt to reunite the country under his rule. China and the United States were drawn into the war, and the rest is history. 3 million Koreans were killed, 1 million Chinese, 54,000 Americans, and in 1953 the Korean War ended with an armistice, and the two sides remained divided along the demilitarized zone. After the Korean War, the capital city of Seoul was in ashes. It looked not unlike Dresden or Hiroshima after World War II. And as for the film industry, it was also devastated. The studios were destroyed, cameras and equipment were largely lost, and cinemas were destroyed, and the great majority of pre-war film elements, prints and such, were also lost. The production companies that literally emerged from these ashes had to temporarily relocate their base of operations to Busan, which is South Korea's second largest city on the southeastern tip of the peninsula. South Korea was extremely poor after the Korean War, and the rebirth of the movie industry not only provided an inexpensive form of entertainment, but it also helped to kind of chronicle the plight of the country in much the same way that Japanese and Italian cinema did after World War II. The catalyst for the revival of the film industry was a film called The Story of Chunhyun. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. The Story of Chunhyun. It was a 1955 adaptation of a traditional folk tale, a love story set in feudal times that virtually all Koreans know. This was actually a remake of the first Korean talkie from 20 years earlier. But anyway, it was a huge hit, attracting 200,000 people, and the film industry exploded in the second half of the 50s because of this. I'd like to stop here for just a second and talk about the dubbing of this movie. Most of the films released by American International in the United States, I'm talking about the Japanese monster films, had halfway decent dubbing. I know everybody likes to make fun of dubbing, but it's a really difficult thing to get right, and the team that did this for AIP largely did a very, very good job, I thought. There were professional actors, and the scripts were, competently written. The dubbing for this film, by comparison, was mailed in. Listen to the script. They'll be hitting Yonggari soon. They're going to be using guided missiles. This soldier likes the line so much he tells it to our hero twice.
They're going to hit Yonggari any minute. They'll be using guided missiles.
Thank you, sir. We heard you the first time.
Really?
There'll be no use. Well, let's hope they are. Anyway, I have my orders.
Then I guess we better go to headquarters.
I'm sorry.
A number of directors played prominent roles in this renaissance of Korean film, and one of the most significant, particularly from a commercial standpoint, was the director of Yonggari, Mr. Kim Ki-duk. In 2010, the Busan International Film Festival in South Korea paid tribute to Kim Ki-duk. There have been a lot of tributes to him in recent years, actually. And there was a retrospective of his films, and as part of that, they produced a documentary short called Director Kim Ki-duk on the Front Line of Korean Genre Films. And that's very much Kim Ki-duk's legacy. He was known as a very versatile director who worked in multiple genres and made lots of commercially successful pictures, and a few that are considered milestones in the history of Korean cinema, including this one, believe it or not. The narrator of this documentary says, quote, "In the post-war cash-strapped Korean film industry, this man," that's Kim Ki-duk, "was the driving force behind the revival of Korean cinema, experimenting without fear and open to new challenges," unquote. The documentary also calls him the wizard of genres and the gentleman of the film industry. And indeed, in this documentary, you can see Kim is very much a distinguished older man. He's bald with a small mustache, and he wears a casually stylish blazer and an ivy cap. You can see him walking around the film festival grounds. In interviews, he comes across as quite humble and soft-spoken. Kim Ki-duk was born in 1934 in Seoul and was the oldest of 8 brothers and sisters. His parents were well off, and they wanted him to go to medical school, but after the Korean War broke out, Kim Ki-duk had to flee Seoul as a refugee, and he ended up in the city of Busan, and there he worked as an interpreter at a U.S. Air Force base, so it's safe to assume that he speaks English fluently. Now, this was 1951, before he had even finished high school, and Kim really had no thoughts of working in film, but in Busan he met the director Lee Jong-gi, and that's what sparked his interest. Kim originally wanted to be an actor, but that didn't go anywhere. So after the war, he entered the film business and began to apprentice under 2 directors, Jong Chang-gun and Han Hyung-mo, and that's how he learned the craft of directing. The chemical weapon they're putting together to use against Yonggari looks a little bit like a breakfast drink. The pseudoscience in this film is fairly modest by genre standards. They spent so much money on the special effects, it's possible they just didn't have the kind of funds to build any kind of elaborate lab or lab equipment, but that's just speculation. Kim Ki-duk apparently was already working in film when he graduated from college in 1956 in creative writing. In 1959, he joined Korea Entertainment Corporation, one of the new studios that had formed, and he became a full-time editor. In fact, it was said that he was known as quite a skilled and creative editor. Around this time at Korea Entertainment Corporation, he met a man named Cha Tae-jin, a production executive and former journalist, and the man who was instrumental in bringing CinemaScope to Korea. Together, the two of them formed their own studio in 1961 called Gyeokdong Hyungup Corporation, or Far East Entertainment Corporation, as I'm going to call it from now on. You may have noticed in the opening credits that Cha Tae-jin is the producer of Yongguri. Kim Ki-duk would serve as Far East Entertainment's executive vice president while he directed movies exclusively for this company. Kim Ki-duk directed his first film in 1961. It was titled Five Marines, and rather than a traditional war film focusing on the fighting, this was considered a breakthrough, a war film with humanist values, and it really focused on this group of Marines and their daily lives, which were largely filled with doing menial work and writing letters to their wives and girlfriends. It was really about their feelings and their lives as men. It all ends rather tragically when the 5 South Korean Marines go on an ill-fated mission to bomb an ammunition dump in the north. 5 Marines earned the Best New Director Award for Kim Ki-duk at the Daejeong Film Awards in 1962. I want to mention here briefly also that several of Kim Ki-duk's movies are available for free to stream on the YouTube channel of the Korean Film Archive with English subtitles in high def. So if you're interested, please search for that. Kim Ki-duk directed 66 films during a 16-year-long career, and unlike some of his contemporaries who were more critically acclaimed, he was really considered a hit maker, someone who had a knack for connecting with the audience and following social trends and using them in his movies. The film critic Kang So-won describes Kim Ki-duk this way, quote, "Kim was generally not considered an auteur. He did not focus on any specific subject that could be framed in a single category, nor did he passionately pursue a unique visual style of his own. It was not necessarily because he lacked the will or artistic desire to give his work uniqueness and consistency. Rather, he was the type of director who stressed the importance of communicating and sharing empathy with the public." We're coming up here to my personal favorite shot in the entire movie, where Yongguri inhales massive amounts of flame. I remember just thinking that was so cool as a child, and it's definitely another visual connection between this film and the Gamera films. And in a moment, we're going to get a nice view of another one of the miniature sets, this time a military rocket installation in the side of a hill. And in these scenes, notice that the entire family takes part in the operation to fight the monster. They're all riding in the helicopter, and they could easily be killed together. It's part of the theme of the movie, and we'll talk about that shortly. So director Kim Ki-duk had a conviction that movies should be a popular form of entertainment, and that is what naturally led him to try out all sorts of different genres. He made war films, comedies, romantic comedies, melodramas, horror, action, youth romance, sports biopics. He really wasn't interested in making period films, nor in movies based upon highbrow type literature. Kim Ki-duk's most popular film, considered his signature work, is called Barefoot Youth, released in 1964, and it sold 260,000 tickets. This was a youth romance story about a lower-class boy, a sort of gangster kid, who saves a well-to-do girl from a gang of thugs, and the two of them fall in love despite their class differences. You can see where this is going. It had a sort of Shakespearean tragedy to it, but at its heart, the film was actually a reaction to the patriarchal traditional values of the adult generation, and it really struck a chord with young audiences by revealing their feelings and frustrations. It started an entire wave of Korean teen angst films, and certainly was part of the global teen movie explosion that began in the 50s with Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause and other films. But it's also worth mentioning that Barefoot Youth was apparently adapted from a Japanese Sun Tribe film. That's a genre that centered on Japan's post-war disillusioned young people. The 1956 Strange Fruit is usually credited with starting that trend. Kim Ki-duk had already made one movie called Private Tutor in 1963 that was based upon a Japanese novel. And in fact, Korean film critics at that time were taking some directors to task for emulating Japanese films too much, but nevertheless, Barefoot Youth was a huge hit. So even in spite of the cultural ban, which, by the way, was enacted in 1945 when Korea was liberated, even though that prevented Japanese films from being legally distributed in South Korea at this time, obviously Korean filmmakers were influenced by what Japanese filmmakers were doing and aware of what they were doing. And one trend that Kim Ki-duk recognized was the popularity of Japanese giant monster movies. The films directed by Ishiro Honda for Toho were the top of the heap around this time. Of course, King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962 was an enormous hit in Japan. And in 1964, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster was also a big box office smash. By the mid-1960s, the other Japanese studios were making these films as well. Daiei had launched the Gamera series of films, which usually had a little boy or boys befriending a giant turtle. And in 1967, all 5 of the major Japanese studios released at least one giant monster movie. A kaiju boom, it was called. The Japanese monster films were not only popular at home, but they were also highly exportable. They were popular in the United States, Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so on. So from a business standpoint, this is why Kim Ki-duk and his company, Far East Entertainment, would have become interested in making one of these films. Another reason, though, was that the Korean film industry was now under increasing government control and censorship, and there was pressure not to make socially relevant films such as The Barefoot Youth, and instead to present family-friendly stories. In 1961, South Korea's civilian government had been overthrown in a military coup, and General Park Chung-hee took over as president, position he would hold until he was assassinated in 1979. Now, Park was a Cold War-era authoritarian type of ruler. He was credited with modernizing South Korea, developing its industry, its economy, its military. But on the flip side of that, he was an authoritarian and was known for harshly suppressing dissent and limiting personal freedoms. To that end, in 1962, Park Chung-hee's regime enacted the motion picture law, which gave the government direct oversight of the film studios and eventually consolidated the film industry from 70 studios and production companies to just 4. Films could be confiscated or banned if they were considered sympathetic to communism or if they were thought to violate obscenity standards. And as a result of all this, and this is a quote from an article written by Thomas Giamarco on the Korean Film Archive website, quote, "Although the early part of the 1960s is known to have a relatively large number of high-quality films, or films that examine the social condition, the latter part of that decade had almost none," unquote. And so this shift led to the appearance of children's films in the second half of the decade. In 1967, the same year that Yongari came out, Korea had its first animated feature film, Honggildong, which is based upon an old children's folk tale. And that was a tremendous success. Well, we're coming up to the very memorable scene where Yongari and the little boy dance. They look like they're dancing the twist to a version of Arirang that sounds a bit like it's played by the Ventures. Arirang is, of course, the most famous of Korea's folk songs. And this version's instrumental, so Song-ho, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the song's lyrics and what they mean.
Arirang is about a person who is deeply sorrowful because someone very important to him or her is leaving. The lyric is short and very plain and simple, but because of that there are a variety of interpretations of the song, and many Koreans learn and sing it from the very early ages. It is also known internationally as a signature song of Korea. Director Kim Ki-duk once said that the reason he created this particular scene is that as the film was mainly for the children and the family audience, he tried to show something unique and funny, interesting. There are many versions of Arirang across Korea, but this surf rock arrangement was indeed unique, and it never fails to make the audience crack up. I mean, every time, at every screening of Yongari, the audience can't stop chuckling at the scene.
Because there was no precedent for this kind of film in South Korea and there was no expertise in special effects techniques in the industry, Far East Entertainment reached out to Toei Studios in Japan, and through Toei, they hired a small team of freelance special effects artists who would lead that side of this production. Chief among these men was Masao Yagi, a monster suit designer and builder who oversaw the making of the Gamera suit in the first Gamera film, and Yagi would be credited as Yongari's special effects director. There was also Akira Suzuki, who specialized in designing mechanical miniature props, and there were 3 other men who apparently headed up the special effects art department. This was the first collaboration of its kind between the Japanese and South Korean film industries, and even though there was a ban on the importing of Japanese culture, the South Korean government not only tolerated this project, but they actually encouraged it. The fact that the 2 countries had signed a normalization treaty a couple of years earlier and that Japan had paid $800 million in reparations for the colonial period, that probably helped. Interestingly, a man named Lee Byung-woo acted as a go-between to help arrange for the Japanese effects technicians to work on this production. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Lee Byung-woo, but apparently he was a Korean national who, during the colonial period, had adopted the Japanese name Kan Inoue, or Inoue Kan. And during the 1930s, he had moved to Japan and worked there as a cinematographer on documentary films. Among other things, he was a cameraman on the 1939 documentary Snow Country, which is celebrated as the birth of true Japanese documentary filmmaking. But in any case, this gentleman not only helped arrange for the Japanese crew to come and work on the special effects, in the Korean credits for Yongari, he is listed as the special effects cinematographer for this film. Right here, there's a quick cameo by Twist Kim, who made his debut as an actor in Barefoot Youth, directed by Kim Ki-duk, and then went on to become a big star of youth films. He plays the MP here who quickly rubs his hands together, an old traditional gesture, a way of begging for forgiveness or mercy. Principal photography for Yongari began on April 3, 1967, and the special effects shooting started 3 days later, on April 6. The effects took about 3 months, and they were shot at 2 studios in Seoul called Hanyang and Miyari. The finished film reportedly had 280 special effects cuts, and the team shot 3 to 5 cuts per day. At the time this film was released, the producer Cha Tae-jin told a newspaper that, paraphrasing here, it was unfortunate that the studio had to go outside of South Korea for help with the special effects, but they planned to seize this opportunity to learn so that Korean special effects would take a leap forward here. The miniature models, the tanks, rockets, cars, and so on, reportedly cost 5 million Korean won, or just under $20,000 to make, and there were 12 miniature sets, and as you can see, some of them, like this bridge over the Han River, were quite large, and those sets cost 7 million won, or about $27,000. The cost of creating the Yongari suit was 1.2 million won, or roughly $5,000, and the suit actor, the man inside Yongari, was named Cho Kyung-min, and his payday was 100,000 won, or about $400. The newspapers also reported that 15,000 tiny light bulbs were used on the miniature sets, and if we're reading this correctly, it says that 2/3 of all the available studio lighting equipment in South Korea had to be gathered up and used on this production, and 500,000 won worth of gunpowder, or about $2,000, was used to blow things up. Of course, we have to keep in mind that the studio may have inflated those numbers a bit for publicity's sake. This film received a lot of publicity, a lot of press while it was shooting. Much of it centered around the fact that this was the first use of miniature photography and other techniques in South Korea. One article published May 2, 1967 in the Kyunhyung Shinmun newspaper was rather skeptical, wondering if Japanese monster movies were now infiltrating South Korea. The writer said that while the Korean film industry was trying to forge a new path, which was admirable, It remained to be seen if this type of movie would succeed here because of the high cost of special effects, and those words would prove to be rather prophetic before long. This film was quite successful at the box office, and from what we understand, the reviews were also quite good. We found one review from the Kyunhan Shinmun newspaper from back in the day in which the writer praised the film for its production values and also seemed to be looking at it as a savior of the Korean movie industry. Quote, "The miniature sets of the city of Seoul, or tanks or fighter planes, were delicate and real," unquote. And paraphrasing, the writer goes on to say that this will breathe fresh air into Korean cinema. And while the writer acknowledges that there's Japanese input, he says what he really feels is the Korean side's spirit. And he says that the film might be a turning point for new possibilities as the film industry is restricted and has its back against the wall. So with all the success and all the hoopla, why wasn't there a sequel to Yongari? Why wasn't there a franchise built around this? Well, as that writer alluded, the situation in the South Korean film industry was becoming increasingly difficult, in large part due to the fact that so many households were acquiring black and white television sets and staying home to watch TV. Also, government controls over the film industry tightened in the 1970s, and the industry entered a period of depression. Production companies started to go out of business, and that was what happened to Far East Entertainment in 1972. According to news reports at that time, the company blamed the high production cost of Yongari and their inability to recover their investment at the box office for long-term financial difficulties. They owed 2 million won in back taxes to the government, and because they couldn't pay it, they had to sell off the studio and shut down the business. And after that, Kim Ki-duk would continue to direct films for a few years, but he retired in 1977 and became a film professor. His partner, the producer Cha Tae-jin, apparently got involved in the circus business and also lost a lot of money in that as well. He would die in 2003. Well, the family that slays the dragon together stays together, I guess. Once again, we have all of our heroes in the helicopter happily risking their lives to confront the monster and dump the chemical weapon on him. Sung-ho, what do you make of this?
I think this is another example of the family friendliness of this movie. Director Kim Ki-duk tried to focus on the adventure of the two families, mainly because at that time Korea is a large family society, and there are usually 2 or 3 generations of families living together. And that naturally means the target audience would be those variety of generations of families. I think this is one of the uniqueness of this motion picture because contrary to the Japanese giant monster movies, especially the original Godzilla movie, which has a very somber and tragic tone, Yongari is mostly about how families overcome this destruction and mayhem caused by the giant monster. Making the two families as a protagonist make Yongari a very interesting example of all the special effects movies made in 1960s.
It's difficult not to feel badly for Yongari in these scenes where he's writhing in such terrible pain, and in a few moments he's going to appear to die one of the most undignified deaths of any giant monster, bleeding from an orifice that shall remain nameless. Well, even if the company that made Yongari eventually went bankrupt, this film was exported around the world, which was one of the goals that the producers had in making it. We have seen theatrical posters from Germany, Belgium, Japan, Italy, France, Canada, and Egypt. Far East Entertainment partnered with Toei Company, the same company that brought over the special effects guys, and Toei acted as the international sales agent for the film. And Toei's name was featured prominently on the posters in many territories, and that may be why some people mistook this film for a Japanese production rather than a Korean one. In fact, in both Germany and Belgium, the monster was called Godzilla, at least in the way that the title was mistranslated or rewritten in the local language. The question still remains as to what happened to the original Korean language negative for this film and whether it'll ever be found. Some people have wondered whether the negative was shipped to the United States when the film was first distributed here, but we've found in our research pretty conclusively that that's not the case, that the negative did not end up here. Sung-ho, what do you know about what happened?
The complete Korean version is indeed lost. In 2008, the Korean Film Archive hosted the screening of both the incomplete Korean version and the US version of the film. And at one of the screenings of the film, director Kim presented the film and had a short talk session. At the session, he said that because Korean films were not usually exported overseas during the 1960s, the filmmakers and the studio had basically no experience dealing with international distribution. So they sent the foreign buyer the precious material such as the original negative and the sound elements. It is unthinkable today, but unfortunately, what's done is already done.
And a couple of years ago, in an interview with a Korean publication, director Kim speculated that the original negative might have ended up in Japan, and I assume that means it might have been sent to Toei. When the Japanese movie studios were attempting to market their films overseas back in the day, they sometimes would employ copywriters for whom English did not appear to be their first language, and this often had some wonderfully, if unintended, humorous results. In its efforts to sell Yongari overseas, Toei prepared some of these materials, and, I'll just give you an example. One of the taglines was, "Yongari, why makes people cry and tremble?" And this was superimposed over images of Yongari destroying a city. But really, for our purposes, the most interesting thing that Toei prepared was an English language synopsis, a broken English language synopsis of the story. And there are two paragraphs in there that I want to read to you. The English is a little bit imperfect, but listen to the story details and compare them to what happens on screen. Now and all, they are ready to bring back the peace to Korea, and at the same time, Yongari gets a chance to ride in the biggest rocket ever made in our history for another planet where the circumstance is more agreeable to him. And on top of that, the young scientist Ilu gets married in a biggest wedding ceremony ever held in the history of Korea. It sounds like they were watching another movie, but this is actually an example of what Sung-ho was talking about earlier, where the details were lost when the dialogue was translated into English. In this scene here, at least according to the original Korean language script, when they're interviewing the boy, he tells the reporters that he wishes that all the scientists of the world would join forces to build a big rocket and ship Yongari to another planet where he could live in peace. And he also says that he wishes not only that his sister and Ilu would get married, but that they would have a big giant wedding, one of the biggest in the history of weddings, I guess. It's not apparent when watching the English version, but the Korean version of the film strongly suggests at the end that Yongari didn't die. You remember the scene in the helicopter where the boy asks them to stop pouring the chemical weapon on the monster and let him live. It's strongly implied that the monster lives and is just shipped out of town. This film has continued to be an inspiration for certain film fans and filmmakers in Korea. In fact, Shim Hyung-rae, the director of D-Wars, which came out in 2007 and is the most expensive Korean film of all time, it's about dragons running amok in Los Angeles, he has cited Yongari as a primary influence. So there's a through line from 1967 to today. Yongari is usually credited with being the first giant monster movie from South Korea. Admittedly, there aren't that many of them, but we don't even know if that's entirely true. There was a 1962 film version of Pulgasari, and it's just not entirely clear at this point whether the monster in that film was giant or ordinary sized. Unfortunately, that film has been lost. In 1967, just shortly before Yongari was released, there was another giant monster movie, a black and white, all-Korean production called Space Monster Man Wangmagwi. In fact, the producers of Yongari tried to sue the producers of that other film for infringing upon their idea. The other giant monster films that we know of from South Korea are Ape, the 1976 King Kong ripoff that's wonderfully bad, starring Joanna Kearns. There's a 1980s giant monster film called The Flying Monster, which unfortunately I haven't seen. In 1999, Shim Hyung-rae, the D-Wars director, reimagined and remade Yongari with CGI. It's not a terribly good film, but it was a valiant effort. There's the 2006 film Host, probably the best of the lot, and that is about a monster that emerges from the Han River. And lest we forget, there was the 1985 North Korean version of Pulgasari, which was directed by the South Korean Shin Sang-ok, who had been notoriously kidnapped and forced to work in North Korea. As for the legacy of this film, I think the actor Lee Sun-jae, who plays the astronaut, kind of sums it up best. He says, at the time, in some countries where the film industry was more developed, there was some doubt as to whether films were even made in Korea. I believe it was a brave experiment. Thank you, Sung-ho. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to me too. And before I finish, I'd like to thank Mr. Hong Gi-hoon of Big Monster Club, who provided some of the anecdotes we have discussed here.
And thanks to everybody for listening.